I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Thank you, Brian. I will do the technical thing here for a moment because I have a few slides. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I see a lot of familiar faces in the room, and I think, and as I greeted some of our attendees this morning, I thought back to last fall, and many of you will recall last October 22nd, which was 5 weeks after the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy, the Manhattan Institute sponsored a conference entitled Market Meltdown, the U.S. Financial Crisis. And at that time, the outright panic of the summer and early fall had begun to dissipate, but there was still a very palpable sense of shock and uncertainty in the air when we convened that conference. And I remember I participated in a panel discussion entitled Balancing New York's Books. And there was one thing that was clear then, and is clear now, and we all agreed on. Wall Street as we knew it had changed forever. And after decades of steadily growing much more and more dependent on tax revenues generated by a very heavily leveraged financial sector, New York State had arrived at a day of fiscal reckoning. Things had to change. Now, at that point in the fall of 2008, Governor Patterson was sounding a very similar theme. In fact, he'd been warning of a full-blown economic and fiscal collapse for months before it actually happened. Now, you have to remember that New York politicians have a long tradition of denial and of blaming forces beyond their control for all their problems. I think it was John Lindsay back in the 60s who first raised that to an art form. In my own professional life, I saw Mario Cuomo and David Dinkins both play that theme again and again of large forces beyond the control or even the understanding of mere mortal men that were rocking the poor tiny boat in the sea of unchangeability, etc. David Patterson, of all people, who's really in many ways the quintessential creature of Albany, after 21 years in the state legislature, broke with this tradition, at least during much of his first year in office, after taking office on March 17th, which was the day Bear Stearns collapsed into the arms of Morgan Stanley. He strongly emphasized that the state's looming financial problems were, in fact, mainly its own fault, that they were the result of many years of excessive spending. He repeated this again and again. Again and again, he had a variation on the same statement. He said, the Wall Street well is run dry, and we need to deal with the consequences. So he was preaching sort of a gospel of self-reliance, and I think it raised expectations about what was to follow. In fact, it was enough to remind many of us of Hugh Carey, who brought an end to the Rockefeller era with his famous declaration in 1975 that the days of wine and roses are over. And he proceeded, in fact, to govern in line with that statement. Now, the problem is that in the event, Governor Patterson did not end up delivering on his rhetorical promise. And that's illustrated in a way by this chart, which is actual and projected total spending by the state of New York, actual up to 2009, projected through 2013. Now, you might think there'd be some ebb and flow in the rate of spending growth related to economic cycles, but if you just looked at this chart and then just return from your long trip to Mars, it would be hard to spot any recession, unless you look closely at the dark blue portion of the bar, which is the portion of the budget that the state pays for out of its own revenues. And what you see is that has essentially flattened for the time being, while the budget is rising quite dramatically. Why? We have Washington to thank for the federal stimulus funds, which is essentially a fiscal bridge to nowhere. Now, unfortunately, the governor, though, even before the stimulus package appeared, set the stage for a bad result in in his initial December budget proposal, which called for a small spending increase,